The desert had a way of swallowing sound, especially in Big Bend National Park. Even in August, when the cicadas screeched in the heat and the air shimmered above the rocky earth, there were moments when the silence was so deep it felt like the land itself was holding its breath. On August 5, 2020, its silence would become the backdrop to a mystery that would haunt the park for years. At Panther Junction Ranger Station, the heart of operations for the park shift change was underway. The rangers who had endured the blistering heat all day were filing in, handing over reports, signing off vehicles, and placing their portable radios in the charging docks along the wall. A low hum of conversation and the occasional laughter of tired colleagues filled the small, wood-paneled room. Ranger Ronan Wabby's radio was there, too, charging, which was strange because Ronan wasn't. It took a few minutes for anyone to notice. At first, it was assumed he was running late. Ronan, 61 years old, with a frame that still carried the lean muscle of someone who had lived a life outdoors, had been with the National Park Service for decades. He was known for his methodical nature, his unshakable calm, and his deep respect for the rules of the job. Leaving without signing off was unusual, but leaving without his radio was unthinkable. By 6:47 p.m., the sun was casting jagged shadows across the Chisos Mountains, and the air in the station began to shift from casual end-of-day chatter to a sharper edge of concern. Ranger von Hoppertal, broad-shouldered, with a demeanor that always bordered on casual to the point of lazy, was the last person to have spoken to Ronan. He recounted that an anonymous report had come in earlier in the afternoon about unauthorized campfire smoke near Mariscal Mine, one of the most remote and treacherous areas of the park. The old mercury extraction site was an 8-hour hike for most visitors. But for rangers with a high-clearance vehicle and the knowledge of unmarked service roads, it was reachable in just under an hour. It was late in the day, and most rangers were finishing their rounds. Hopper said Ronan had overheard the report, said he'd handle it, and left. He hadn't taken his radio. Hopper suggested maybe Ronan had just forgotten it in his rush to check the area before nightfall. But Ronan didn't forget things. Not his water supply. Not his revolver, an older model he'd been grandfathered into carrying when the park switched to semi-automatics. Not his radio. His lifeline in a place where a twisted ankle could become a death sentence. Calls to his personal cell phone went unanswered. Unsurprising given the dead zones that stretched across much of the park. Still, by 7:30 p.m., with darkness closing in, a decision was made. A search would begin immediately. 2 rangers drove toward the Mariscal Mine access road, their headlights cutting through the dust in the darkness. The road was narrow, unpaved, and riddled with sharp rocks that could shred a tire in minutes. Even with a 4-wheel drive, the trip was slow. When they reached the mine's entrance, they found Ronan's patrol vehicle parked off to the side. Locked. No sign of its driver. They scanned the area with high-powered flashlights. No footprints. No discarded equipment. No sign of a campfire, authorized or otherwise. By midnight, the search had expanded. More rangers, border patrol agents, and local deputies were combing the area. The night was still and heavy, broken only by the whir of helicopter blades overhead. The temperatures had dropped into the low 80s, but the ground was still radiating the day's stored heat. The next morning brought the full force of a search and rescue operation. Helicopters, drones, and ground teams fanned out from the mine. K-9 units struggled in the heat, their paws burning on the baked rock. The scent trail, if there ever had been one, was gone. By the end of the first day, not a single clue had been found. It was the kind of disappearance that left seasoned searchers unsettled. In the wilderness, there are usually signs disturbed. Vegetation, discarded gear, tracks in the dust. But here, there was nothing. It was as though the desert had opened up and taken him whole. Back at the station, Ronan's son, Ronan Wabby, arrived after driving through the night from Odessa. A police officer himself, Ronan's mind worked in patterns, questions, possibilities, inconsistencies. And from the moment he heard that his father's radio had been left behind, something in his gut told him this wasn't an accident. His father knew the park better than most people knew their own neighborhoods. He had patrolled every trail, navigated every arroyo and canyon, and survived countless summer days when the temperature soared over 110 degrees Fahrenheit. He didn't just respect the dangers of Big Bend, he understood them in his bones, and he knew how to survive them. "You don't just lose someone like my dad out here," Kalen told the lead investigator. "If he's not coming back, it's because someone doesn't want him to." The search pushed on for days, the teams enduring blistering heat and dangerous terrain. But with each passing hour, hope faded. The report of campfire smoke was rechecked. No evidence of a fire was found, not a scrap of charred wood, not a smear of soot on the rocks. And then came the detail that turned the search into something darker. The campfire report had been anonymous, untraceable, no callback number. It was beginning to look less like Ronan had been unlucky, more like he had been lured. By the 5th day of the search, Big Ben's son had become the enemy. Helicopters cut lazy circles over the Mariscal mine area, their pilots scanning the maze of ridges, arroyos, and talus slopes for any sign of movement. Teams trudged in 30-minute shifts, forced to retreat to shaded rest stations to avoid heatstroke. The desert was winning. Ronan Wabby stayed close to the search command tent, reviewing maps, questioning the rangers who had worked with his father, pushing for updates that never seemed to come. He was polite but relentless, his presence a constant reminder that this wasn't just a case number. It was his father's life. The searchers had covered the obvious routes first: the mine entrance, service roads, the dry riverbeds that cut deep channels through the desert floor. Then they pushed into the less traveled terrain, where rock gave way to loose scree, and each step carried the risk of sliding into a gully. Still, nothing. On the 6th morning, the search coordinator quietly told Kalen that they were scaling back. The teams would focus on recovery rather than rescue. The unspoken meaning was clear. They no longer expected to find Ronan alive. Kalen didn't accept it. If he's out there, he's waiting for us to find him. If he's not, then someone knows where he is. He kept circling back to the one detail that didn't fit the landscape the campfire report: a fake call to send his father to one of the most isolated corners of the park. Why? The investigative team from the National Park Service began pulling phone records, but the call was a dead end. It had come through a relay system that masked its origin. Whoever had placed it knew exactly how to disappear into the gaps of rural telecommunications. Then, on day 8, the investigation took a turn. Border Patrol agents working with the search teams stumbled upon a cache in a deep wash several miles. From the mine, plastic water jugs, shrink-wrapped packages of food, discarded clothing, and crude sleeping mats. It was the kind of stash smugglers used a temporary rest point before moving people or contraband through the desert. The find set off a flurry of activity. Forensic teams moved in, photographing every footprint, every scuff mark, every scrap of fabric. The theory that Ronan had interrupted a smuggling operation seemed to fit, but as the analysis came back, hope of a quick breakthrough evaporated. The footprints were degraded. The food wrappers and water bottles were weathered, their manufacturing dates months old. The site had been abandoned long before Ronan vanished. It was a false lead. By the 3rd week, the helicopters were gone. The mobile command tent had been packed up. The park resumed its uneasy rhythm: tourists hiking Chizo's basin trails, campers setting up along the Rio Grande, rangers patrolling in pairs. But for those who had been part of the search, the air felt different. Something had happened in Big Bend that didn't make sense. And the desert wasn't giving up its secret. Kalen drove back to Odessa with his father's personal effects, a small box of items from his locker at the station. His father's field notebooks were in there, worn from years of being tucked into a shirt pocket. Kalen flipped through them that night, reading entries about weather patterns, plant growth, and wildlife sightings. Then one note caught his attention. Saw the waste truck near Maverick Road again. "No scheduled stop," driver said, checking for illegal dumping. Odd. There were more. Notes about the same truck appearing in remote areas where it didn't belong, driver giving vague explanations. At the time, Ronan hadn't seemed alarmed, just curious. Callan couldn't shake the feeling that this was important. It would be nearly 2 years before he learned just how important. For now, the case went cold. The official file described Ronan as presumed deceased, body unrecovered.
Internally, though.
There was a quiet acknowledgement among some investigators. This wasn't the desert's doing. It was someone's plan. June 2022 arrived hot and restless. In Big Bend, the desert baked under a merciless sun, the days stretching long and airless. For nearly 2 years, Ranger Ronan Wabby's disappearance had been little more than a fading ghost in the minds of all but his family. But the desert wasn't done with the story. 2 17-year-olds from El Paso, Jarek, Pasternak, and Silas. Granholm had a habit of lying to their parents about where they camped. This time, they'd said Guadalupe Mountains. Instead, they drove south, chasing the thrill of finding something no one else had. They were obsessed with abandoned mines, scavenging old equipment, and sometimes, though they'd never admit it, to park officials, taking relics home. Their chosen campsite was deep in the Chizos Mountains foothills, far from marked trails. The landscape here was a tangle of steep slopes and thorny brush, punctuated by the occasional skeleton of old mining infrastructure. Late on their second day, Jarek spotted what looked like a partial cave opening near the base of a ravine wall. But as they pushed aside the brush, they realized it was a mineshaft entrance narrow, partially collapsed and invisible from more than 10 feet away. The boys were prepared for this. They'd brought climbing rope, harnesses, and headlamps. After anchoring their line, they squeezed through the tight opening, descending into a darkness that felt thick and heavy. The shaft dropped 20 feet before opening into a horizontal tunnel, its walls shored up by rotting timbers. Dust hung in the beam of their lamps. Every sound boot scuffing on rock, rope creaking echoed off the walls. About 30 yards in, Jarek's light swept over a narrow crevice where debris was piled higher than elsewhere. It looked wrong. The timbers were stacked deliberately, almost like someone had built a makeshift wall. "Silas, check this out," Jarek whispered. They pulled at the pile, first small rocks, then heavier beams slick with damp. 10 minutes. Later, they revealed a black plastic tarp wedged tightly into the space. Heavy duty, commercial grade, sealed with tape. They dragged it into the tunnel's center. The tape peeled away with a gritty rip. Inside, the smell of dust and old cloth rushed out. They saw tan fabric, olive drab pants, a campaign hat crushed flat, a National Park Service uniform. Beside it, wrapped separately in a smaller piece of tarp, lay a revolver older model, well-maintained, its metal dulled by grime. For a moment, neither of them moved. This wasn't the rusty pickaxe or antique lantern they'd been hoping for. This was something official, serious, dangerous. They repacked the tarp, hauled it back through the narrow entrance, and hiked until they found cell service. The call. 2. The sheriff's office was short and shaky. Within hours, the area was swarming with law enforcement National Park Service investigators, deputies, and an FBI evidence team. The shaft was declared a crime scene. Tarp's contents were laid out on a clean plastic sheet. The name tag on the uniform read, Wabby. The revolver's serial number confirmed. What Kalen had feared for nearly 2 years was his father's service weapon. When an investigator flipped open the cylinder, all 6 chambers were empty. No bullets, no blood on the uniform, no tears, no knife marks. The tan shirt and green pants were neatly folded, as if placed in a drawer. Whoever had put them here had been careful. The mineshaft was 30 miles from where Ronan's patrol vehicle had been found. The terrain between them was some of the most brutal in the park. If this was where the uniform and weapon ended up, then someone had moved them. Deliberately, the desert had finally given back a piece of the story. But instead of answers, it handed over a deeper riddle. The tarp, the folded uniform, the empty revolver, each item was packed in separate sealed evidence bags and flown to Quantico within 48 hours. The FBI's crime lab was tasked with answering the question that had been hanging in the air since. The moment the mine shaft was opened, what happened to Ranger Ronan Wabby? The forensic work began with the clothing. Under high magnification examination, there were no tears, no punctures, no abrasions consistent with a struggle, no traces of blood, human or animal. The only particles embedded in the fabric were dust and fine mineral grit consistent with the rock from the shaft. It looked less like a uniform that had been worn during a violent confrontation and more like one that had been removed carefully, almost ceremoniously, before being stored away. This disturbed investigators more than if they'd found bloodstains. Folded, intact uniform meant control. Someone had been in charge of the situation from start to finish. The revolver told a different story. Ballistics confirmed it was Ronan's same serial number recorded in Park Service armory logs. All 6 chambers had been fired, but residue analysis placed those shots roughly 2 years in the past, consistent with the date of his disappearance. 6 shots fired, but no damage to the uniform, no blood, no sign of the target. The obvious question became, where had those bullets gone? A theory emerged, one that felt almost theatrical in its cruelty. Someone had taken the revolver from Ronan and fired it elsewhere, into something that would leave no witnesses, no evidence, and no possibility the gun could be used against them. That theory gained weight 3 weeks later. Got a joint search team, which had been combing remote canyons for any overlooked evidence. Found a concealed encampment hidden in a narrow slot canyon less than 10 miles from the Rio Grande. From the main canyon floor, it was invisible, shielded by a false wall of brush and rock. Inside were the remnants of a temporary camp, discarded water bottles, protein bar wrappers, a few blankets. But what drew attention was the back wall of the canyon itself. 6 tight bullet impacts marked the rock. The grouping was so precise, it could have been used for a firearms training drill. Investigators extracted the slugs with careful chiseling, each one caked in rock dust and sun-baked into the granite. Ballistics matched all 6 too. Ronan's revolver, the empty gun mystery, was solved. A dot. But the manner in which it was done sent a cold ripple through the investigative team. These shots hadn't been fired in a fight. They'd been executed methodically, close range into an unyielding rock face. Whoever had taken Ronan's weapon had neutralized it, with intent making sure it could never be turned back on them, and ensuring any ballistic evidence would point to a meaningless location. This wasn't improvisation. It was procedure. The concealed encampment's location aligned with something Border Patrol intelligence officers knew all too well: a trafficking corridor that had been in intermittent use for years. Unlike more common smuggling routes, this one was sparsely used, reserved for moving high-value cargo people the traffickers didn't want intercepted. Suddenly, the image of Ronan's disappearance shifted. He hadn't stumbled across a random crime. He'd walked straight into a well-protected operation now. Investigators were looking at something far larger than a missing ranger. They were looking at an organization with rules, resources, and a plan that had worked flawlessly until the desert began, piece by piece, to give them away. The bullet match from the canyon encampment gave the investigation a direction, but not a name. Whoever had taken Ronan Wabby's revolver had also taken him. Not likely alive at first and moved both far from where his patrol vehicle was found. The 30-mile gap between Mariscal Mine and the Chisos. Foothill mineshaft wasn't something a man could cover on foot in that terrain without supplies. That distance screamed one thing: vehicle transport. Investigators began a full sweep of vehicle logs for the day Ronan disappeared. This meant digging through Big Ben's labyrinth of operational records, contractor sign-ins, service vehicle, GPS data, waste disposal manifests, fuel receipts, and license plate reader hits from cameras on the park's outskirts. At first, the picture was as empty as the desert. But then a technician noticed something strange in the automated waste station data from a small facility on Highway 385 just outside the park. A contracted waste removal truck had entered the park early the morning of August 5, 2020. When it passed the waste station on the way out late that evening, it was heavier than when it had entered. Significantly heavier. For a vehicle that was supposed to be removing waste, this made no sense. Waste collection usually means more weight going in than out supplies, fuel, water, and a lighter load after disposal. This truck had reversed. That equation, its route log, pulled from contractor records, added another red flag. On that same day, the truck had made a detour through the Mariscal mine sector. Despite having no scheduled pickup or maintenance there, the deviation was so minor in the raw log that it hadn't raised alarms in the original 2020 review. But now, in context with the way anomaly, it screamed pretext. Investigators dug into the company. Small local operation with a government contract to handle waste from remote park stations. No obvious criminal history. The scheduled driver for that? The mid-40s? No major priors, had been doing the route for over a year. Then Ronan Wabby provided the final shove toward suspicion. He'd been poring over his father's field notebooks again and brought one entry to the investigative team: waste truck parked near Rio Grande, village no reason. Driver said checking for illegal dumping. Odd. There were multiple entries like it, all noting the truck's presence in remote or restricted areas. Ronan had been watching it for months. He hadn't flagged it as criminal, just strange. Strange had become dangerous. The scenario began. To crystallize, the waste truck had park service clearance, could travel to remote sectors without suspicion. On the day Ronan disappeared, it was in the right place at the right time. It left the park with more weight than it entered. Hours after he vanished, inside the task force's command post, one investigator put it bluntly: "We're not looking for a missing hiker anymore. We're looking at a Trojan horse." Surveillance began quietly. The company's fleet was monitored. The driver was followed. At first, his routes looked normal. Then, slowly, a pattern emerged: brief, unscheduled stops and isolated pullouts. Interactions with unmarked vehicles, nighttime trips to locations outside park boundaries. One of those locations was a sprawling private ranch, miles from the nearest paved road, owned by a man named Ronan Wabby. Wabby was wealthy, reclusive, and according to D intelligence, likely connected to organized criminal operations. His property was fortified with fencing, cameras, and guards. The waste trucks made regular visits there. The trafficking corridor theory now had legs. The truck wasn't just carrying garbage, it was carrying people the organization didn't want found. And if Ronan had stumbled across a transfer in progress at Mariscal Mine, they couldn't let him walk away. The question that still hung in the air was one no one wanted to say out loud. How had they known Ronan would be the one to respond to that fake campfire call? That answer would turn the investigation inside out. The waste truck's connection to Ronan Wabby's fortified ranch was enough to keep the surveillance operation alive for weeks. Every movement of the fleet was logged, every deviation from the schedule marked. The driver from August 5, 2020, a prime person of interest, was tailed on and off duty. But the operation's real. Breakthrough didn't come from a camera or a tail car. It came from a confession the task force hadn't even asked for. The driver wasn't arrested yet, but he was feeling the heat. One night, parked at a roadside bar miles from town, he got into a loud argument with another man. A sheriff's deputy happened to be in the parking lot when the driver stormed out, the deputy who recognized him. From the bolo circulated to local law enforcement, called the task force, top 2 days later. Under the pretext of an interview about contract irregularities, the driver sat in a bare room at the Brewster County Sheriff's Office, facing 2 federal agents. At first, he denied everything. No extra cargo, no odd detours, nothing but trash runs and bad coffee. Then one agent dropped a photograph on the table, Ronan Wabby's field notebook, open to the entry about the waste truck parked near Rio Grande Village. The driver's eyes flicked down for half a second, enough for the agents to press. Hours later, he broke. Not fully, but enough to give shape to the shadows. Yes, the truck had been used for more than waste. Yes, he knew where it went. Yes, Ronan Wabby was involved. And yes, someone in the Park Service fed them information. The driver wouldn't say the name outright. But when asked how they knew to lure Ronan to Mariscal Mine that day, he said something that made the agents sit forward. "We didn't have to guess. We had the guy who decided where everybody went." Back at the task force command center, the suspect pool shrank fast. Only a handful of people had the authority and routine opportunity to redirect rangers on patrol. Only one of them had been the last to see Ronan alive, Ranger Von Hopper. On paper, Hopper's record was clean. No disciplinary actions, no financial. Red flags, nothing that screamed criminal. But when the task force pulled his bank activity, the picture shifted. Deposits in cash, irregular, and large enough to raise eyebrows, with no legitimate source. Trips to El Paso and Presidio that coincided with known trafficking surges. More damning. When investigators quietly searched Hopper's park-issued laptop, they found evidence of file access outside normal work hours patrol schedules, enforcement operation plans, even internal radio code updates, and there was the matter of the campfire call itself. The phone system logs showed it coming in as anonymous, but deeper technical analysis revealed the call had been routed from a Wi-Fi network in a location only a handful of park employees had access to, the secured staff break room at Panther Junction. On August 5, 2020, security footage placed Hopper in that room at the exact time the call was made. It wasn't just bad luck that Ronan had gone to Marscal Mine that evening. Hopper had made sure of it. The betrayal hit the investigative team like a physical blow. A ranger luring another ranger into an ambush, it violated the core of what the badge meant in the Park Service. The task force wasn't ready to move yet. They needed more than circumstantial evidence, needed to tie Hopper directly to Quaid's operation. They wouldn't have to wait long. By late September, the investigation had been running almost entirely under blackout. Only a handful of park employees knew that the waste removal truck inquiry was really a multi-agency operation targeting a trafficking ring. Hopper was still on the job, wearing the same uniform Ronan had worn, working the same station he'd helped turn into a hunting ground. The task force had no illusion. Quaid's ranch was a fortress. Aerial photos showed high fencing, electronic surveillance, and armed guards stationed at two main entry points. Intelligence suggested the property held multiple buildings, a sprawling main house, equipment sheds, and a converted barn large. Enough to hide a semi-trailer. The waste trucks visited regularly, sometimes pulling in under cover of night. The decision was made. A coordinated raid, hitting both the ranch and Hopper simultaneously to prevent any warning from leaking out. The warrants would be executed at dawn. 400 hours raid day, the convoy rolled out in darkness. FBI tactical teams, Border Patrol, Border operators, D agents, Texas Rangers, and local deputies. Armored vehicles moved in tight formation down the dirt road leading to the ranch. Helicopters hovered low, rotor wash flattening the mesquite. 3 hours perimeter units sealed the road. No one in, no one out. Spotters confirmed guards moving toward the main gate. 5 hours breach teams hit both entry points. The gate locks went with a metallic shriek. Flashbangs lit the pre-dawn gloom. Shouts in English and Spanish ordered everyone down. Inside the ranch's central yard, the operation split. One element took the main house, where Olin Quaid was found. In his bedroom, blinking under the glare of weapon-mounted lights. He was in custody before he could reach for the phone on his flash nightstand. The other element moved to the converted barn. For 19 hours, the barn's double doors were reinforced from the inside. Hydraulic breachers forced them open in less than 90 seconds. The first operators inside stopped cold. The interior was divided into a grid of metal-barred cages, each secured with heavy padlocks. The smell hit them first, stale air, sweat, waste. In the dim light, shapes huddled together, shielding their faces. Children, teenagers, young adults. They were gaunt, barefoot, dressed in torn clothes. Some had visible injuries. All were terrified. A medic called over the radio, "We've got them multiple victims alive. Stand by for numbers." As the cages were opened and water distributed, agents found makeshift bunks, plastic buckets for toilets, and stacks of bottled water in one corner. It was a holding pen, temporary, but efficient. The kind of place people disappeared into before being moved further north, in the back of the barn. It's concealed behind tarps were two of the waste trucks. False walls and hidden compartments lined the interiors, perfectly sized to conceal human cargo from casual inspection. 2 hours. Panther Junction, 50 miles away. Ranger Von Hopper was starting his shift when a tactical team entered the station. The ranger on desk duty froze as Hopper was ordered to stand, place his hands behind his back, and was cuffed in front of his colleagues. No one spoke. Post-raid the search of Quaid's main house, turned up ledgers with coded entries, burner phones, and, in a locked desk drawer, laminated copies of internal park patrol schedules, documents that should never have left official servers. Alongside them were sheets of paper with Ranger radio frequencies and codes. Updated to match recent changes, the chain was now unbreakable. Quaid's trafficking operation, the waste trucks as transport, Hopper as the inside man feeding patrol, intel and setting up diversions. The only piece still missing was the answer. Ronan Wabby had been chasing for 2 years. What had happened to his father? That answer would come from the weakest link in the chain, the waste truck driver. The driver sat across from 2 federal agents in an interview room, eyes fixed on the styrofoam cup of coffee in front of him. His hands trembled not from caffeine, but from the weight of what he'd agreed to do. His lawyer had told him bluntly, "You want to see daylight again? You'd better give them everything." And so he began to talk. It started with the campfire call. The driver confirmed what investigators had suspected. There had never been a campfire. The report had been phoned in from inside the Panther Junction break room by Von Hopper himself. The plan wasn't random. Hopper knew which Rangers were on duty, which routes they were covering, and which one could be counted on to respond without backup. Ronan was the perfect target. He was known for volunteering to handle last-minute calls, especially ones in dangerous areas. The driver said he was already staged near the Mariscal mine sector in the waste truck, its hidden compartments loaded with 9 migrants. The plan was to meet 2 guides coming north from the Rio Grande, load their group into the truck, drive straight through to Quaid's ranch under the cover of his service contract. When Ronan's vehicle appeared on the dirt track, shifted, he rolled up, got out, asked what I was doing there, the driver recalled. Before I could say anything, 2 guys came out from behind the rock shelf. They had rifles. He didn't even reach for his gun. They had him cold. Took his revolver first. Then came the uniform shirt, pants, belt, hat. The driver said one of the armed men told him it was policy to strip any law enforcement officer they caught, both to check for trackers and to break their will. Ronan was forced into one of the truck's hidden compartments, alongside the migrants. The space was barely tall enough to crouch. The air was stifling. The driver's voice tightened when he described leaving the park. "We hit the way station heavier than we went in because of him, because of the load. Nobody stopped us." Once at Quaid's ranch, Ronan was pulled from the compartment and taken into the barn. The driver claimed he didn't see what happened inside, but later that evening, one of Quaid's men told him bluntly, "We couldn't keep him." Ronan was executed that night on a remote section of the property. His body was buried shallow, the earth hard and dry. The driver insisted he didn't fire the shot. As for the uniform and revolver, those were handled days later. The armed men took the revolver to the canyon encampment and emptied all 6 rounds into the granite wall. Then they wiped it clean, wrapped it with the folded uniform in a tarp, and carried it by a TV to the abandoned mineshaft. The hiding place was chosen precisely because it was far from the disappearance site meant to mislead anyone who found it. The driver gave exact GPS coordinates for where Ronan's body was buried. Within 48 hours, search teams were on Quaid's property. The desert gave up what it had held for nearly 2 years: skeletal remains, identified by dental records as Ranger Ronan Wabby. The news hit Panther Junction like a thunderclap. Even the Rangers who had quietly suspected foul play weren't prepared. For the blunt truth, one of their own had walked Ronan into an ambush. For Kalen, it was no shock only, a quiet confirmation of what he had known from the moment. He saw his father's radio sitting in its charger. The arrest of Ranger Von Hopper was deliberately public. It wasn't about humiliation. It was about making it clear to every ranger in the national park. It's fervous that this betrayal had come from within, and it would not be buried quietly. At 8:12 a.m., Hopper was escorted out of Panther Junction Ranger Station in full view of his colleagues. His duty belt was gone, his uniform untucked, his wrists locked in stainless steel cuffs. No one spoke to him. No one met his eyes. He said nothing on the ride to the federal holding facility in Alpine. During the first interrogation, federal agents slid the stack of evidence toward him, bank deposits, phone logs, GPS records, the campfire call traced to the staff break room, and the driver's sworn statement, placing him at the center of the ambush. Hopper stared at each page, jaw tight, then finally looked up. "You don't know who you're dealing with?" he said quietly. "You think this ends with me? He'll kill me in here before I say a word," and that was it. No denial, no confession. Just the flat certainty of a man who knew the organization he'd served was bigger than the cell he was about to enter, while Hopper clung to silence. The driver's cooperation and physical evidence from Quaid's ranch filled in every gap for prosecutors. Olin Quaid was charged with federal human trafficking, conspiracy to commit murder of a federal officer, and dozens of related counts. Hopper was charged alongside him for conspiracy, aiding and abetting, direct participation in the murder. The trials were high-security affairs, with both defendants moved under armed escort and proceedings often closed to the public for witness safety. Several of the rescued migrants testified, describing being loaded into waste trucks and driven for hours in stifling compartments. For Ronan Wabby, the hardest testimony came from the medical examiner, who confirmed his father had been shot once in the head, execution style. The bullet was recovered with the remains and matched to a firearm found in a locked storage cabinet in Quaid's barn, a weapon unrelated to Ronan's own revolver. The driver testified under a plea agreement. His account of August 5th was calm, methodical, and devastating. He pointed to Hopper in the courtroom when asked who had made the call that sent Ronan to Mariscal Mine. Hopper didn't look up. The jury deliberated less than 2 days. Both men were found guilty on all counts. Sentencing was swift. Life without parole. Hopper's face didn't change as the sentence was read. Quaid's operation was dismantled piece by piece. The ranch was seized. The waste removal contract was revoked. The company dissolved. Federal audits were launched into every active service contract inside the National Park Service, looking for similar vulnerabilities. But the damage at Big Bend was done. The tight-knit trust among rangers, the unspoken belief that no matter the danger outside, the man or woman beside you had your back, was fractured. When Ronan stood at the small memorial for his father in the Chizos Basin, he spoke only once to the gathered crowd of rangers, agents, and locals. "My dad thought this land was worth protecting. It meant protecting the people who came here, too. Someone decided money was worth more than that, and it cost him his life. Don't let it happen again." The wind that day carried his words out over the desert. Ronan had once walked in a tan shirt and campaign hat, believing the badge on his chest meant something unshakable. The desert never gives everything back. By the time the trials were over, Big Bend had returned to its familiar rhythms, sunrise light painting the Chizos peaks, tourists winding along the Ross Maxwell Scenic Drive, the Rio Grande snaking quietly through the canyons. But beneath the park's surface, something had shifted. At Panther Junction, Ronan Wabby's locker stayed empty. The nameplate was still there, a small square of metal no one wanted to touch. New rangers joined the station, but they heard the story within days, not the sanitized version, but the real one told in quiet voices during night patrols or over coffee on the back steps. Some rangers admitted they worked differently now. They double-checked orders. They kept their radios closer. They watched. The trucks that came and went, trust had become a luxury, no longer assumed. The National Park Service rolled out new security measures across all parks contractor background checks. GPS tracking for all service vehicles, stricter access controls, on-patrol schedules. The official statement was clinical, focusing on process improvements and increased operational integrity. Between the lines, everyone knew it was a reaction to Big Bend. For Ronan Wabby, the changes were too late. He'd buried his father on a windswept hill in Odessa, the badge polished and placed beside the folded flag. He'd sat through the sentencing, watched Hopper led away, seen Quaid's face when the gavel came down. None of it filled the gap. He kept his father's field notebooks in a drawer by his desk. Sometimes he'd open one at random, tracing the neat block letters that noted sightings of javelinas or the seasonal return of turkey vultures. On the last page of the last notebook, in handwriting slightly more hurried than usual, was the final entry Ronan ever made. Waste truck had gone off. Route. Same driver? Doesn't add up. There were still questions no one could answer. Hopper had hinted the organization was bigger, more dangerous than they knew. The driver had claimed he didn't know who called the shots above Quaid. No one knew. Who had first recruited Hopper, or how long he'd been feeding them information? The FBI's organized crime unit kept the file open, chasing whispers of similar operations in other remote parks, other borders. The possibility that Big Bend had been just one node in a larger network lingered like heat haze on the horizon. In the end, the case became part of Park Service history, a cautionary tale taught in training rooms, a reminder that threats didn't always come from beyond the fence line. The desert still held its silence. It still baked the earth in August until the air shimmered, still swallowed footprints in a day, but it kept Ronan's secret for nearly 2 years. And it had only given it up because 2 teenagers had been curious enough to crawl into the dark. For those who had known him, that was the hardest truth. Not that he died in the line of duty, but that the person who'd walked him into danger had been wearing the same uniform, on quiet nights, long after the last tourist had left the basin. The rangers who remained sometimes thought they could hear footsteps in the gravel near the old Mariscal Mine Road, and they wondered if Ronan could speak, whether he'd tell them about the day he was betrayed, or whether he'd just warn them to keep their radios close and their eyes on the road ahead, because in Big Bend, danger didn't always come from the desert. Sometimes it came from the man standing right beside you.